A fully loaded oil tanker, 2 million barrels of crude on board, is moving through one of the narrowest stretches of ocean on the planet. Somewhere in the darkness, an Iranian Revolutionary Guard drone closes in. The tanker erupts in flames. That is not a hypothetical. That is 2026. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important energy choke point on Earth, is effectively closed. Ships are on fire. Sea mines are drifting in waters that, just months ago, carried a fifth of the world's oil supply. Over 230 loaded oil tankers are sitting stranded inside the Persian Gulf, going nowhere. The International Energy Agency has called this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The head of the IEA described it as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Brent crude surged toward $120 a barrel. Wall Street is now openly discussing $200 oil. Governments across Asia are rationing fuel. Europe is bracing for a crisis that could rival 2022, and the developing world is already suffering in ways that rarely make international headlines. This is not a regional story, this is a global one. And in this video, we are going to break all of it down: how we got here, what is happening right now, who is winning, who is losing, and what comes next. Let's get into it. To understand this crisis, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, not just as a name on a map, but as a mechanism. The strait sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, connecting the Persian Gulf to the open Arabian Sea. At its narrowest point, it is just 34 kilometers wide, but within that, the actual navigable shipping lanes are just 2 miles wide in each direction. 2 miles of water through which, before this crisis, approximately 20 million barrels of oil passed every single day, roughly 1 in every 5 barrels of oil traded globally. It also carries 20% of the world's LNG, most of it from Qatar. In 2024, an estimated 84% of crude oil shipments through the strait were destined for Asian markets, with China receiving a third of its oil via the strait. Europe gets 12 to 14% of its LNG from Qatar through this same waterway, and there is no real bypass. Alternative pipelines exist: Saudi Arabia's East-West line, the UAE's Fujairah pipeline, Iraq's Ceyhan route, but combined, these alternatives had only increased to 7.2 million barrels per day by early April, compared to the more than 20 million that used to flow through the strait itself. The math is brutal. There is no plan B. This is not the first time the world has stared into this abyss. Iran threatened closure during the tanker wars of the 1980s. It threatened again in 2011, 2012, and 2019. Each time, the world worried. Each time, Iran backed down. That history created a dangerous assumption, that closing Hormuz was always a bluff. That assumption just proved catastrophically wrong. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States began a series of strikes against Iran, targeting its nuclear and ballistic missile program. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the strikes. Iran retaliated with missiles and drones across the region. And then, for the first time in history, beginning March 4th, Iranian forces declared the strait closed, threatening and carrying out attacks on ships attempting to transit it. The IRGC issued warnings forbidding passage, boarded and attacked merchant ships, and laid sea mines in the strait. Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd suspended all transits within days. The flow of oil the world had taken for granted for half a century stopped, almost overnight. Now let's walk through what happened next, and more importantly, what is really driving it. Global oil supply plummeted by 10.1 million barrels per day in March, the largest disruption in the history of the global oil market. Gulf countries cut total oil production by at least 10 million barrels per day as storage filled up with oil that had nowhere to go. For context, this exceeded the demand destruction caused by COVID-19 at its worst. Then the LNG shock hit. On March 18th, Iran struck Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG complex, causing a 17% reduction in Qatar's LNG production capacity, damage estimated to require 3 to 5 years to fully repair. LNG spot prices in Asia surged by over 140%. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all exports. Europe, which had spent years pivoting toward Qatari LNG after Russia cut its pipeline gas, suddenly found that lifeline under threat too. A ceasefire was reached on April 7th and 8th, but it changed almost nothing. On April 9th, 230 loaded oil tankers were still waiting inside the Gulf, with Iran restricting and conditioning all traffic. Washington escalated. The U.S. Navy entered the strait for mine clearance operations. Talks in Islamabad collapsed, and on April 12th, Trump declared a full U.S. naval counter-blockade of Iranian ports. The world now had a double blockade: Iran blocking outbound oil traffic, the United States blocking inbound access to Iranian ports, two hostile naval forces operating in the same narrow, mined waterway. Here is the hidden fact almost nobody is reporting. Iran reportedly lost track of mines it had planted in the strait and is therefore unable to fully open it. Even a perfect diplomatic agreement cannot immediately restore oil flows. The strait needs to be physically cleared, and that requires military cooperation between forces that are actively threatening each other. Now let's talk about China, because its behavior in this crisis is one of the most revealing geopolitical stories of the decade. China receives a third of its oil through Hormuz. Its Gulf crude imports dropped 25% in March 2026. Its economy is being squeezed by exactly the energy shock it can least afford. And yet, China vetoed the UN Security Council resolution that would have helped protect shipping through that same strait. Beijing made a strategic calculation that a post-Khamenei Iran reshaped by US influence poses a greater long-term threat to Chinese interests than the short-term pain of a closed strait. China is willing to absorb significant economic damage to preserve a friendly government in Tehran and to deny Washington a decisive strategic victory in the Middle East. But there is a deeper lesson China is absorbing. The ease of the Hormuz blockade has sharpened Chinese concerns about the United States' ability to disrupt China's own oil imports during a potential Taiwan contingency by blockading the Strait of Malacca. China is not just watching this crisis, it is studying it as a rehearsal for its own potential future conflict. And then there is Russia, the quiet winner. Moscow saw a significant rise in demand for its oil and gas as Gulf exports were disrupted. The situation became so acute that Washington temporarily eased its own Russia sanctions, granting India an emergency waiver to purchase stranded Russian oil cargoes to stabilize domestic fuel prices. The United States dismantling part of its own sanctions architecture because Hormuz left it no other choice. That is what energy dependency looks like when it breaks. The human cost of this crisis is being written in real time, and it is being written most painfully in Asia. 60% of India's LPG demand passes through Hormuz. The shortage led to long queues, delayed deliveries, restaurant closures in Mumbai, and the shutdown of Gujarat's ceramics industry. People turned to kerosene, coal, and wood as substitutes. Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Pakistan faced severe fuel rationing. The Philippines declared a state of emergency. Zimbabwe and Nigeria faced crippling shortages. Europe faces a slower but potentially deeper wound. The crisis coincided with European gas storage at just 30% capacity after a harsh winter. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks nearly doubled. The ECB postponed rate cuts and raised its inflation forecast. UK inflation is expected to breach 5%. Chemical and steel manufacturers impose surcharges of up to 30%. The continent is staring at stagflation, rising prices, slowing growth, a central bank with nowhere to turn. And then there is the crisis nobody is talking about: fertilizer. The Persian Gulf accounts for 30 to 35% of global urea exports and 20 to 30% of global ammonia exports. Up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizers normally transit Hormuz. When the strait closed, it did not just cut off oil, it cut off the inputs that farmers across India, Africa, and Latin America depend on to grow food. The energy crisis is quietly becoming a food crisis. In conversations with dozens of oil traders, executives, and analysts, one message was repeated consistently: the world still has not grasped the severity of the situation. Many drew parallels with the 1970s oil shock, warning that a prolonged closure would threaten an even bigger crisis. So where does this go from here? There are three realistic scenarios, and the world is currently balanced on the edge between all three. The first is a negotiated resolution. Pakistan-mediated talks are ongoing. On May 6th, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi flew to Beijing for talks with Wang Yi, as efforts to broker a peace deal between Tehran and Washington picked up pace. By May 7th, Brent crude had fallen below $100 a barrel on reports the US and Iran were nearing a deal for the gradual reopening of the strait. If talks succeed, the US lifts its counter-blockade, Iran opens the strait, mine clearance begins, oil returns toward $80, and the immediate crisis eases. But the structural damage to global energy security remains. The world now knows the strait can be closed. That knowledge cannot be unlearned. The second scenario is prolonged stalemate. The dual blockade holds. Talks collapse again, as they have before. At $170 a barrel, the impact on global inflation and growth roughly doubles. a stagflationary shock that could shift everything from the path of central banks to the outcome of elections worldwide. The developing world tips into genuine humanitarian crisis, Europe enters recession, and the global economy absorbs a wound that takes years to heal. The third scenario is re-escalation. Iran passes its proposed legislation permanently weaponizing the strait. The US responds with strikes on Iranian naval infrastructure. A new, wider phase of conflict begins, and the global energy system faces a shock with no modern precedent. The wild card in all three scenarios is China. Analysts say China's significant stakes in the US-Iran war and the role Beijing could play in influencing the direction of the conflict are now center stage. With Trump and Xi's summit looming, the US has been putting increasing pressure on Beijing to use its influence with Tehran to bring Iran to the table. China has more leverage over Iran than any other actor on Earth. The central question of this entire crisis, is whether Beijing chooses to use it. And that brings us to the final thought. The Strait of Hormuz was always described as the world's most critical choke point. Analysts wrote about it, war games simulated it, energy ministers feared it, but for decades, the actual closure of the strait remained theoretical, a risk that was priced in, planned for, and ultimately never tested at full scale. It has now been tested, and what the test has revealed is this. The global energy system is far more fragile than the world believed. Emergency reserves buy weeks, not months. Alternative pipelines cover a fraction of the gap. The UN cannot enforce freedom of navigation when two permanent members of the Security Council refuse to allow it. And the economic pain of a closed strait spreads faster, wider, and deeper than any model fully captured. Whoever resolves this crisis, whether it is Trump, Xi, Pakistan's diplomats, or Iran's new leadership, will not just be reopening a waterway. They will be deciding what the rules of global energy security look like for the next generation. And for billions of people around the world who simply want to cook their food, heat their homes, and fill their tanks, the answer cannot come soon enough.